In late 2019, Locomotive 489, a Class K36 locomotive, went down for a Federal Railroad Administration mandated 1472-day inspection and replacement of the smokebox. On December 15, 2020, the railroad announced that they are converting Locomotive 489 to burn oil instead of coal. The decision was made to ensure viability in diverse environmental conditions. 489 normally runs out of Antonito, where oil is stored in a tank car. We were surprised to see it heading the regular train out of Chama on October 2nd, 2021. I was told it wasn't the first time she had run out of Chama. The trip was made under threatening skies, but the rain held off until we got to Los Pinos. A highlight was when 489 stopped short of the crossing and had to build steam pressure to continue up the long grade to Cumbres Pass. Sit back, enjoy the video, and hit that like button. This history of 489 was written by Earl Noob and used here with his permission. The year 1981 will undoubtedly go down as a great one for Western steam enthusiasts. The excitement of Railfair Sacramento 1981, restoring of the 4449 to daylight livery, and the rebirth of Union Pacific 3985 make the spring of 1981 a time that will long be remembered by all. But while all this excitement was going on, high in the mountains of northern New Mexico, another locomotive was about to be born again. The shop force of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad at Chama, New Mexico, was putting the finishing touches on the newest member of their stable of former Denver and Rio Grande locomotives, the number 489. Engine 489, built by Baldwin, was delivered to the Denver and Rio Grande Western in August of 1925. She was the final engine in the K36 class, thus becoming the final narrow-gauge locomotive built for the railroad. The 10 K36s, 480 to 489, were part of a general upgrade of the railroad's narrow-gauge locomotives that allowed longer, faster trains and the retirement of the remaining small power dating from the 1880s. The number 489 more than likely started working for the Rio Grande on the trackage from Alamosa to Durango, but when she was less than 9 months old in the spring of 1926, the 282 was involved in her only major derailment. Drifting light down Cumbres Pass towards Chama, she apparently struck a broken rail on a fill and rolled over several times before coming to rest on her left side about 100 feet away from the track. Most of the damage was minor, but the cab was a total loss. The locomotive was soon righted and hauled off to Alamosa for repairs. The 489 was quickly repaired and then settled into an ordinary life hauling freight on both the Salida to Gunnison and the Alamosa to Durango routes. In May of 1951, the 489 pulled the last passenger train, a Rocky Mountain Railroad Club excursion, over the Monarch branch and down the valley line as far as Villa Grove, returning to Salida. This was the locomotive's first and only fan trip under the D&RGW's ownership. By the end of the year, the locomotive was working the Salida to Gunnison route exclusively, and the valley line from Salida to Alamosa had been abandoned. The 489, along with 5 K36 engines, were marooned. The last 4-engine stock train over Marshall Pass on October 9, 1953, found the 489 on the point, and then she pulled the scrap train used to dismantle the Marshall Pass line in 1955. With the Gunnison mainline gone, the 489 was used on the Monarch branch until that track was converted to standard gauge in 1956. With all of the 3rd Division Salida to Gunnison track gone, the 489 and 4 sisters that were left marooned were loaded on standard gauge cars and shipped south for use on the Alamosa-Durango-Farmington line. However, by 1960, traffic on the last narrow gauge route was in decline, and one by one, as their time ran out, the railroad set aside the motive power that was not needed. The 489 was one of these cast-off engines, and in November of 1960, she was set aside. In 1963, the railroad stopped hauling oil out of Chama, eliminating even more locomotives from the active rolls, and 7 of the remaining 23 locomotives, including 489, were classified as permanently unserviceable. The 489 now had considerable company on the Alamosa Rib Track, and the end was apparently in sight. One of the 7, K37-490, was already being cut up, and the 489 herself was being robbed of parts for the serviceable locomotives, a policy that continued until Rio Grande abandoned the Alamosa-Durango-Farmington trackage in 1968. In the summer of 1970, the 489 was sold to the states of Colorado and New Mexico for use on the new Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, operating on the old main line between Antonito, Colorado and Chama, New Mexico, although in this case the word use still meant supply parts for other operating locomotives on the railroad. The 489 left Alamosa being towed in the last dual-gauge train the Rio Grande operated when it turned all of its 3-foot gauge equipment over to the States. A few days later, the 489 arrived in Chama, where she sat until the spring of 1980, slowly being relieved of whatever parts were needed to keep the other locomotives in service. In 1980, the passenger-hauling Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad was much improved from 10 years previous. An ongoing tie replacement program was accounting for several thousand ties a year, and a new engine shop had been built in Chama. As the Chama shop did not have a wheel-turning lathe, let alone a drop pit to remove drivers out from under the locomotives, both conditions were rectified by the spring of 1981, and the Cumbres and Toltec began looking for another engine to rebuild from among those in storage. The 483 was quickly scratched off the list, as she had been retired by the Cumbres and Toltec in 1977 due to the same problems facing 484, in addition to needing a new firebox flue sheet. The 492 was eliminated because of her 1902 boiler. The only 2 left were 482 and 489, and both were visually in poor shape. Because her driver tires were better and there was little more left to start with, the 489 was chosen for the rebuild. By May, the 489 was starting to look like a locomotive once again. The spring rigging was done and the side rods were back in. The cab had been replumbed and new wood installed on the cab floor and on the new sides and roof. The steel cab sides themselves had been replaced with new steel, and the smokebox fittings had been replaced, including a new petticoat pipe and cyclone along with a new exhaust nozzle. Finally, the 489 was given several coats of shiny black enamel paint and trimmed and lettered in aluminum. The engine was topped with a 5-chime whistle from Earl Noob's collection. The big day arrived on June 8, 1981, when at 8:20 a.m. a fire was started in the 489's firebox for the first time in over 20 years. A few more days were required to iron out a few bugs, fix a few steam leaks, set the safety valves, and soon, leading to Friday, June 12th, when the locomotive took her first steps under her own power since 1960, when she made a short trip just under a mile in length out of Chama. A few more days of work found the 489 ready to venture out on the railroad. On Wednesday, June 17th, she made a trip from Chama to the summit of Cumbres Pass, towing a flat car loaded with ties. Although the trip was not without incident, she performed well and the outing was a success. However, it was another 2 weeks before 489 was considered roadworthy for regular service. On Friday, July 3, 1981, the 489 highballed out of Chama with Train 2, the New Mexico Express. She had little trouble climbing the 4% grade to the summit, and a grand show was put on for the few fans who were there to witness the event. It took another 2 weeks to finally get the bugs out and to get all of the bearings to run cool, but the 489 joined the 487 and 488 in the regular rotation and proved to be an excellent performer for the road's passenger runs. She also got involved in a couple of extra runs too, starting with a chartered work-train fan trip in late September hauling Jordan Spreader OU and assorted outfit cars from Chama to Bighorn and return. The second outing, after the regular season ended, found her lettered Texas Pacific Railroad for use in a television documentary filmed in Chama and west of Antonito. As always, thank you for watching this video and please subscribe to the channel.